Yep, cool. And let me try to get the Zoom stuff out of the way so I can actually see my notes. So, hi, I'm Shino, a Yuri VN dev. Last year I spoke at VNConf on the topic of feature polish, and this year I'll be talking to you about the art of asset reduction, making more with less, the speedrun VNConf 2024 edition. So this talk assumes that you've already scoped down your story and you created a list of scenes that you need to figure out how to represent without blowing your budget, your timeline, your wrist, or whatnot. This is ultimately an art talk, and it's not a talk about where or when you should scope down or what you should remove from your game. I'll be talking through various methods of presentation that can be used to reduce the asset production work of your game if done right. And as a note, I'll be using examples from various visual novels, and note that many of these games actually have pretty insane amounts of art assets that you might not be able to make. But many of these methods I'll be talking about are useful for not only asset reduction, but also for storytelling in general. So I'll hop right into it, starting off with the topic of abstraction. So by abstraction, I mean to bring the focus to the idea that visual novels are both visual and novel. So sometimes what's on screen is not necessarily as important as what is in your writing. So don't disregard what your writing is and try using some abstraction to put more emphasis on the text details rather than what's on screen, and also get away with drawing a lot less. And the most obvious example of that is the black screen, where really there's nothing on screen except for your text and possibly your UI. So this will bring the focus all onto the text and bring the reader into the narrator's world, making you and the reader and whatnot sink deeper and deeper into the text. So all imagery, if any, is up to the reader's mind's eye. And this is great for things like monologue, introspection, scenes that just simply lose their wham if you're trying to depict it with pictures on screen, since sometimes the text goes way harder than necessarily some pictures on the screen. So the black screen is a great and very cheap way to add dramatic effect and forward introspection by removing distractions while also allowing for additional ambiguity that might add some mood to the scene. But of course, it is just a black screen, so note that it's very reliant on writing, and there's very limited movement because there is nothing on the screen, so don't overuse it since people do want to see pictures, and oftentimes they also want to see colors. But speaking of colors, colors can also do the same type of thing as the black screen in terms of abstraction. Just like black conveys things like loneliness, introspection, darkness, just a sense of there's nothing else there, other colors such as red can convey things like blood, fear, horror, and whatnot. So you can go ahead and also use solid color screens for other moments that might not fit the black color, but you want to have ambiguous and cause the reader to, focus more on the text rather than the pictures. And again, being easy to create is an obvious perk. But now you're thinking, sure, okay, but I can't make a VN entirely of solid colors, right? And I still have scenes that are a bit ambiguous, and I don't necessarily want to portray with a whole new CG, sprite, or BG, but I also don't think it really fits with just a solid color. Well, a more visually interesting cousin of the solid color screen is the sky BG. So it's something that's a little more difficult to create than, say, a solid color screen, but still generally a bit less work than a fully rendered piece of background art. It's a very convenient way to fill the screen for a scene that's transitory, such as the passage of time, or something that's just too short to warrant making the player absorb a whole new location, and for making your BG artist draw a whole new BG. It's great for setting the mood with color, time, and weather, and the Sky BG is actually very versatile. You can get lots of different variations of just even the same period of time and whatnot, which can help you set the mood of your scene a bit better. Similar concepts will also apply to other things, such as the abstracted visuals in Tunige for action scenes like the slashes and whatnot that can show up on screen rather than necessarily your artist drawing a whole action scene and animating it or whatnot. So Sky BG, just like solid color screens, are a great way to use abstraction to get away with, not actually drawing characters, backgrounds, and whatnot. But still, you're thinking, okay, so you said that there was going to be Yuri and cute girls in this talk, so where are the cute girls? So you might be thinking, okay, cute girls. There's cute girls on screen right now. What are you going to talk about now? So as it turns out, the mood setting abstraction background can also work great with characters on screen. So you probably read some manga because you're listening to a visual novel talk, and a lot of y'all are weebs. So a non-visual novel example of what I'm talking about is in shoujo manga when the hot guy shows up or something like that, and the screen is just filled with those special effects of sparkles, flowers, and whatnot. So you know that that's not exactly what's going on. They're probably in the school somewhere, but the simplified BG and effect convey to you the overwhelming emotion of the protagonist that focus your eyes on the star of the show, the topic of your fascination, the heroes of your story. And the same thing can also be applied to VNCGs. So abstracting away the background to emphasize the characters is typically more common with CGs since staging can be difficult if you're totally abstracting the background away to colors like this. But it's a great way to focus on the characters more while making the background really simplified to more so emphasize the mood and the tone of whatever is going on rather than the location. The location should already be informed to the reader by whatever your text has been doing and then the visuals before and after the CG, sandwiching it to just establish what's going on while bringing the focus of the visuals to what's really important, which is the characters. And now you're thinking, okay, Shino just hates drawing BGs, right? And I mean, that's not wrong, but this will also talk about abstracting characters. So the thing with abstracting characters is sometimes there are characters in your games, like NPCs, that really aren't important enough to get a sprite. So you could totally just get away with not putting the sprite on screen, but then your character will be talking to nothing on the screen, and your players will think, hey, the visuals aren't matching up with what I'm, reading in your text. What's going on? So a way to get around with that is to do the silhouette NPC treatment where you create a silhouette of the NPC that your characters are talking to, which informs the reader that, hey, this character is a secondary character or really not that important, but they do exist. So you can kind of fill in the blank yourself because we don't really, necessarily need to draw in the details of these characters. And similarly, using silhouettes are great for crowd scenes as, again, it focuses your eyes on what's important while still informing your readers of the things that are actually on screen, such as the crowd and whatnot, since the readers are really not looking for you to draw out every single detail of every single minor character that happens to show up on screen. They just want for the text and the visuals to match up and create not a dissonance of their mental model of what's going on and what they're reading in the story. So using abstraction is a great way to cut down on the amount of detail work that you need to make in the art of your visual novel. But there are still things that you have to draw when you have to draw things for a visual novel. So I'd like to jump over to a topic that I really like, which is cut-ins. So cut-ins are a great way to, well, cut down on these things that you need to draw, where you still do have to draw them, but you can draw a bit less than necessarily a full screen thing or a full sprite. So by cut-ins, I mean this type of thing. So the classic cut-in is usually some sort of item, an animal, or an object that is within the frame, like shown here. So typically, the item or creature is within the focus of the frame of the cut-in, and the backing frame is some sort of shape. It doesn't necessarily need to be a rectangle, although I do personally like the rectangular cut-in frames the most. But the frame kind of tells you that this creature or item is somewhere within this location, but it's not necessarily directly within the frame of reference of, say, everything else in the location. So if you have a sprite on the screen, for example, the bird is not gigantic in the same size as the character's head, but rather you just know that because there's a frame, it creates a different frame of reference for the item to be in. So the bird is somewhere within this forest, but it's not gigantic, the same size as the character's head, and it's also not, floating in the middle of the forest awkwardly. So cut-ins in the classical use are great for setting the implicit size and position of items that might be a little small if you put it directly on the screen. And they're also great for, setting the implicit ground if the item is on the ground, and also work as a useful way to have some more thematic imagery for, your UI and whatnot if you're using certain types of frames. So now you're thinking, well, cut-ins are nice and all for these items and little creature things, but those types of items and little creatures are kind of more of a stretch goal for your game, since what really matters for you is the BG, sprites, and CGs, since that really is the core of your story. So let's talk about how different styles of cut-ins can also be used for BG, sprites, and CGs, starting with the topic of BGs. So you can see here that the cut-in is an example and whatnot, but let's see how you can use this cut-in paired together with the backdrop background to figure out where this scene is located. So you see that the cut-in is some sort of thing with tea, scones, whatnot. So it's a location that serves tea or scones, and in the background you can see some sort of downtown. It's a bit foggy and whatnot, but those are details left to the story. So even without story context, you can kind of get the idea that this place is set in a cafe of sorts. So how did that work? Well, the cut-in background model uses what I call the foreground backdrop heuristic, where a backdrop is kind of more like a general BG that gives you the general location in which the specific thing is set. And this can be something as vague as a sky BG, which just tells you the time of day, the weather, and whatnot, to something more like a normal BG, as you see in this example. And then the foreground is the scene identifier, which is a lot more specific, but can also be a bit more of a smaller thing, such as the zoom in of the tea and the scones, which it just tells you the specifics of where it is. So it tells you, we know that this general location is set in some sort of downtown area, but of course there's lots of places downtown, right? So where exactly is it? Well, this one is in a cafe because you see this tea and scones, and then of course your mental model is completed by the fact that there's still text in the story that tells you exactly where this is going on. And now you're thinking, well, I mean, that's cool and all, but that's two pieces of art, right? I can just get away with drawing one piece of art. Well, the thing with the cut-in CG or cut-in BG model is that you can reuse the backdrop. So the more places that you have in the same type of location, the more use and more BG you can get out of the use of cut-ins. So you can get really a lot of cut-ins out. And then that will give you a lot of BGs. And of course, typically I mentioned the reuse of the backdrop, but you can also make use of the foreground cut-in itself in different locations, although that typically includes some narrative stuff going on, since it'll seem a little weird if you have the same cut-in in multiple places. And now you're thinking, well, I mean, that is a cool way to have different locations, but how are you going to put the character art in? So there's various ways to approach it, but one of them is to go for a more comic book type look, where things are overlapping with frames and whatnot. You can think comics, manga, and whatnot. But overall, the cut-in model, especially for BGs, uses a lot of abstraction to build the mental model of what is going on. So as a note, since VNs are not really 3D games, although there was that great talk earlier from Justin about cinematography in 3D space, cut-ins are a way to go for the completely other direction of depiction of things, the more comic book style, where things are overlapping, but the reader is able to build a mental model of what's going on through the things that show up on screen, like the frames with the specific cut-in specific locations and the characters laid out like this. And overall, cut-ins are, well, of course, great for making less art for more backgrounds and filling in space, especially if you have a lot of scenes where there might not necessarily be characters on screen, but they're also uh, quite abstract. And again, the cinematography is a little difficult when you're using cut-ins, but you can always still figure something out. And just as a note, I mentioned that cut-ins are great for filling negative space. Cut-ins are functionally sprites, so they will be taking up the same type of space that a sprite will be. So try not to overlayer too many things or else it'll start looking a bit cluttered. So cut-in use is something I have to keep in mind with the aesthetic of your game. So cut-ins might not necessarily be for everyone, but they're a great way to cut down on the amount of, say, larger pieces of art that you need to make. And what about character cut-ins? So I've talked about the classic cut-in and the BT cut-in, but character cut-ins are also a great way to show characters in positions that are possibly difficult for sprites to portray, or in locations where you might want to separate their position frame of reference from the rest of the scene. So they again use the foreground backdrop dichotomy to help your player make the mental model of what's going on with the cut-in and the general thing. So you can tell that this cut-in is their characters are kind of within the same location as these two sprites there, but they're not necessarily in a position or a location that's very easy for you to put on screen with sprites themselves. So cut-ins are great for conveying things that sprites might have trouble doing, including things that are just poses that drawing a sprite for would be very unwieldy, or you can do more of a close-up that lets you draw less art for. So again, they're great for filling in negative space. And by negative space, I also mean scenes where your character is alone, say monologuing or sleeping and whatnot, and you can't really put the sprite on the screen, but at the same time, if you just leave the BG there, sitting there for a while, your readers will get bored. Given that many players like to see visual change frequently in your VNs, cut-ins are a way to add in that visual change. But again, you might need to consider whether or not you need the art there, since this is talking about asset reduction, not increasing your scope. And now you're thinking, well, can I just reuse stuff for my cut-ins? Well, yes, you can definitely make use of your existing stuff in cut-ins and give them a visually different look while still reusing the same art, such as cut-inifying your sprites and BGs to inform a different positioning or location of your character in somewhere that's not exactly directly the backdrop background, but also somewhere that you don't necessarily want to make a whole new CG or BG for. And in a similar vein of thought, you can also use cut-ins as a very form of framing for other images, like CGs, where you might want to pan or do some movement camera work on a CG, but the CG is not that big. So you can use a cut-in as a frame for the animation to go on. And this is great for allowing multiple framings of the same CG, so you don't necessarily need to draw a bunch of variants, but rather use the cut-in framing to let you have the CG on screen for a longer period of time, which is great since, again, players want to see movement, but we don't really have the budget or the time or, any of that for drawing infinite amounts of CG. So the more use you can get out of one image, the better. But on the topic of drawing more, cut-ins are also pretty useful for enhancing existing CG as a variant, as they can give you different perspectives of the same character. But this is something where you have to draw more rather than drawing less. So keep in mind that the goal is not to draw more, but it's rather to make better use of your assets and what assets you actually need to make. But again, cut-ins are a pretty nice way to do a CG variant without having to draw a whole new CG. So you might want to consider using the cut-in variant style of CGs if you do need different perspectives and don't want to draw a whole new CG. And again, on the topic of CGs, I'd like to mention something called SD CGs. So SD refers to super deformed, and for most of us, we would probably think of it as chibi CGs. So chibi CGs or SD CGs are great for playful scenes, and typically they're easier to draw. But I'd like to note that they generally do lack some reusability since they're functionally simplified CGs, and some games do actually go for full screen SD CGs. But again, this type of thing can make use of the foreground backdrop dichotomy and use the kind of like solid or really not detailed colored backgrounds that I mentioned in the abstraction section. So if you do happen to have scenes that are, say, less serious or more comedic, you might want to consider using SD CGs rather than full-on CGs to fulfill the CG role, as they do tend to be a bit easier to draw than a full-on CG, and they're easy to distribute to different artists since, of course, your chibis won't necessarily have the same look as the fully rendered sprites or CGs that you have in your game. And that's about cut-ins. So what about other ways you can reduce what you need to draw or render? Well, I'll be talking about two things in this section. One of them is palette limitation, and the other one is UI coverage. So by palette limitation, you're probably thinking of the really obvious one, which is grayscale. Do you really need to render full color? Do you even need to decide on what colors the characters have in your character designs? Well, of course, grayscale is a very obvious and easy way to go about it to reduce the amount of color work you need to do. But keep in mind that even if your game or sprites are in full color, palette limitation can be a great way to add some drama or mood to your scene. And again, it is less work to do, as doing a full colored render is typically more work than doing a palette limited render. You might also want to consider doing the opposite with, say, grayscale general art and full color CGs for more drama. But that type of stuff is up to you, so I won't linger on that too long. And on the topic of color palette limitation, it's also pretty useful for things like, again, NPC sprites. If the character is just a little too important to only have a silhouette, but they're still not important enough for you to go through and design all their colors, render all their colors and whatnot. So having a slightly more detailed but palette limited character sprite for NPCs that do need faces can also be a good way to reduce the amount of rendering work you need to do. And secondly, the other thing that I'm talking about, which is the UI limitation, it leads to the question of, do you really need to render things that don't get seen by most players? This really is relevant, especially in games with fully opaque UIs, since the UI is hiding a lot of the screen, so the player is most likely never going to really look underneath what's on the UI. In that case, why are you rendering things that people don't see? Well, there are reasons to render things that people don't see, but if you do know that there's no reason to do so, you might want to consider just not rendering it. For example, if you hide the text box in this game, which is a lot less minimalistic looking, underneath is actually all just black, because there's really no point in rendering things that, don't get seen. But at the same time, the CGs are full window because they'll know that players will, hide the UI sometimes to look at additional art details. So consider what actually needs to get made and what actually needs to get seen with what you need to actually make or render. But that was all about making new things and creating more art. So sometimes you're at a point in life where you really want to make less new art. So you should always keep in mind what you can reuse. Be shameless, reuse your stuff. It builds character, and people really aren't going to complain as much as you might think they will. I have to give the obligatory mention to the CG Begent variant method, which can be used not within only one scene, but also across multiple scenes. So you can obviously reuse things and have variants such as minor items on screen or expressions, or even things like swapping out the backgrounds. But what I really want to focus on for this topic of the layer management that will help you reuse things is to just consider keeping your layers separate or having some sort of working file that lets you have the layers separated, even if you're not doing animation. Of course, when you're doing animation, you really do need the layers separate, and you've seen Justin's talk, which kind of explains how you can use the art to do some fancy stuff with the layers separate. But even if you're not doing animation, it can be a great way to add more visual change from cuts of existing art without even needing you to draw any variants or changes. Just have the art existing, and you can make use of the layers in pretty clever ways to change up what's on screen for your players. And also, do less new art. So this is great for allowing the use of a single image for a longer scene. At the end, players want to see visual change, but you also don't want to have to draw more things. And it's also useful since it's repurposable in different contexts, such as sprites or side sprites if your CG happens to have minor characters that you're really not going to bother drawing a whole new sprite for. But hey, you do have a CG where you can just lift the sprite out of for certain scenes, and also for the animation magic. But this is not really animation talk, so I won't really go into that. And additionally, for things like in episodic games, you should really consider reusing as much as you can, as it will give you consistency as part of a series or brand. And also, you might want to consider doing some minor reskinning for each game scene. But reusing can really help you, create some consistency with your series or brand. So I actually highly recommend it if you're making episodic games or games within the same series. But, even outside of sequels, what works, works. So if you feel like it, it's fine to just kind of reskin what works, such as UIs between Liarsoft's steampunk horror game and their Ghost Yuri game, where a high school girl helps these ghosts play Cupid with other high school girls. Yeah, but that's not to say that you should never reskin stuff, but rather, if you have something good that's going, you might as well use it and then keep it consistent with updates to make it modern, but also, keep the consistency of your works, your brand, and whatnot. And you're thinking, oh, but I don't know about reusing all of this stuff. Isn't that like a little too shameless? Well, I'm not saying that you necessarily need to go super far, but this is an example. This game is older than me, and this game came out in 2022, and I'm over 20. So Kogado, for example, has been using the same rhythm game framework for over 20 years, including for a Switch fan disc of their Yuri VNDev game. So, consider what you can reuse and if you want to reuse it. And incidentally, if you're doing things like reusing minigames, you might want to consider making some sort of template framework to make the reusing easier. But again, this is also not a programming talk, so leave that up to your programmers if you want to do it. So go ahead, make that game. I've gone through a few ways of presentation that can hopefully help you reduce the amount of art assets that you need to custom make, such as abstraction cut-ins, reducing things, and reusing things. But overall, you should just keep in mind that you should prioritize your reusable assets while also maintaining whatever aesthetic you have going on in your game. Make sure that you know what scenes that you actually need to display are, and really just aim for your set goal, don't scope up, and play more visual novels. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
All right. I'm going to have time for one question, so I'm just going to grab one off the bin here. Any advice for abstracting sprites that would be annoying to draw due to size?
Oh, wait, do you repeat that question?
Any advice for abstracting sprites that would be annoying due to the size of the sprite, like a really big monster or something?
I'd say having some sort of cut-in would be a good way to go for it. since it will kind of put the sprite into a different frame of reference, I guess, that tells you that the sprite's not necessarily that size, but it's like somewhere located somewhere else, so it could be larger than that. Or if you happen to be going for, say, like this type of model, which is like a little bit more rare, you could also do something like this with the layering to tell the readers that they're not necessarily like actually that big or located there, but you can kind of fill in the blank yourself with a mental model of stuff.
Cool. All right. I know there was a couple other questions, so just ping Shino in the chat because next up is Python.